Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about telephoto zoom lenses. When I began in photography many years ago, the longest lenses that I used were a 180 millimeter lens and a 300 millimeter lens. But what I discovered as the years went by, that I invested that money in the 300 millimeter lens and I very seldom used it. It was very large and I had to pick and choose the times when I would use it. And so when the camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers came out with longer zoom lenses, for example the 70 to 300 zoom lenses, then I thought, well, maybe I'll go ahead and trade in this 300 millimeter prime lens and get myself a 70 to 300, which I did. And I've used this 70 to 300 to great effect. It gives me greater versatility than a prime 300 millimeter lens because I can use it as short as 70 millimeter, 100, 135, 200, and all the way up to the maximum of 300 millimeters. Something else I like about using this 70 to 300 zoom lens on a small sensor digital camera is that at 300 millimeter setting on the lens, I actually have a 450 millimeter image, and that in a handheld package that's nice, light, and compact. So I really like this, what this lens does for me. There's something else I'd like to point out, is that this Nikon D7100 already has a 1.5 image factor when used with the 70 to 300 lens. But it also has built in a 1.3 image sensor setting, which means that when I set up the camera with the 1.3x image sensor setting at 300 millimeter, my lens goes from 450 millimeter equivalent image to a 585 millimeter equivalent image. But there's a caveat to that. When used with the lens without that setting, I'm using all 24 megapixels that are on the sensor. But when I go to the 1.3 image setting, I'm using 15 megapixels. So I'm using fewer pixels, but for what I do in scenic photography and just fun pictures at the park, this is not a drawback for me. But you know, after a little while I thought to myself, well, what more can I do? What more can I do with a long telephoto lens? Well, when I checked on teleconverters, which I thought would double this lens's maximum focal length to 600, I discovered that Nikon designed this lens as a handheld lens only and as a lens that cannot use a teleconverter. So I was kind of stuck. So what I did is I looked at some other lenses and I came across the 70 to 200 f2.8 and the 70 to 200 f4 lenses. Now they can take a teleconverter. They're designed for it. So I went through and I looked at different teleconverters, the 2x, the 3x, the 1.4, and I decided on the 1.7x teleconverter. So what we have here is when I use this teleconverter on the DX camera with this 70-200 2.8 or f4 lens, when I put the lens onto the camera at the maximum focal length of 200 millimeter, I actually have the equivalent of a 300 millimeter lens in image quality. And this is with a small sensor, so I'm still utilizing all 24 megapixels as soon as I put the lens on the camera. Now if I change the setting to the 1.3 inch image setting for the D7100, a small sensor camera, now the equivalent focal length at 200 rises to 390. So I'm almost at a 400 millimeter equivalent image. But the megapixels utilized drops from 24 to 15. So I have fewer pixels capturing my image. But like I said before, for me, that's all right because I do scenics and just fun pictures. Now when I add the teleconverter to the 70 to 200 lenses, now I have an equivalent 663 millimeter image quality, as though I had a 663 millimeter lens. But my active megapixels now drops down to 9. I have 9 megapixels of the image sensor capturing my image for me. But I don't mind that at all, and the results I get are very good. Now when I use these two lenses with the teleconverter on a full frame or FX camera like the D810, I have at 200 millimeter with the lens right on the camera, I'm using all 36 megapixels available. I can set this camera, the 810, to mimic a small sensor camera with a 1.5x image setting. And at that point, using just the lens, I'm down to 15 megapixels. Those are the pixels that are now being used for this smaller image area to get me to a 300 millimeter image. Now, when I use the teleconverter, the 1.7, I drop down to 9 megapixels available, but my image equivalent is now 510 millimeter, as if I had a 510 millimeter lens on my camera. And what this teleconverter does for me on these two lenses, it enables me to carry a smaller, lighter package than I would if I had purchased a 200 to 500 or a, say for example, a 150 to 600 millimeter zoom lens. And it's not as large an investment. This is about 1/3 the cost of one of those zoom lenses. And so when I'm not using it, I'm not sitting as much money on the shelf as I would if I had one of those lenses. And so this is something that you might consider if you don't often use a long lens and you don't mind utilizing fewer megapixels to make your image. This teleconverter route, or just the 70 to 300 on a small sensor camera, might be sufficient to get you the longer focal lengths that you most likely will use. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll see you later.